Did you know that the first bill ever put forward by a female lawmaker in the United States was an age of consent law to protect children from the legal sexual abuse of grown-ass men? Before the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, which constitutionally guaranteed women's right to vote, individual states like Wyoming and Colorado recognized women's rights. And the first women ever elected to state office fought to raise the age of consent that white male Christian lawmakers had set as young as 7 years old. And it was this battle to protect children from men's sexual predation that inspired millions of American women to buck patriarchal tradition, risking life, limb, and social comfort to join the suffrage movement that ultimately led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. Hello and welcome to Power Culture Coco, home of the Coco. I have ideas. And most of those ideas are about dismantling patriarchal myths so we can begin to heal our wounds of dehumanization and obedience to irrational authority. This is part 2 of our series on the sadism of men who want to repeal women's rights. Unfortunately, this is an important conversation for us to be having. Red pill men, religious tyrants, and conservative weenies of all stripes are openly calling to repeal the 19th Amendment to force women to become the legal property of men once more. Men like this pastor are leading the charge. And skip to this timestamp if you don't need our montage refresher from part 1.
In a nutshell, in general, I don't want to see women in the public sphere. You mean they shouldn't hold political office? Correct. You mean you don't want to see them podcasting? Correct. Well, but what about in the marketplace, with, 9 to 5, careers? No, not that either. Like, I don't want to see women holding positions in the public square. I don't.
There are certain books that I've just had to say, hey, I don't know if this is a bad book, but I don't have time to read it. And so you're not going to read it either. We'll read it together. I remember recently my wife had a book and I saw her reading it on the couch. And it was about pedobaptism. And I said, no, we're not doing that yet. We will become pedobaptists when I'm ready. But my wife's not going to be a pedobaptist for 3 years before I am. And I don't have time to read it right now. I know the arguments will be great. I will agree and disagree. I'm not sure which arguments are better, but for the time being, this is what I'm persuaded of, and you're not going to outpace me. And that's not, for the record, that's not lazy. It can be. And you have to be honest with yourself and discerning of your motives, but that's not inherently lazy. I have 4 people in my life that I dictate the hours in their day. I dictate what time they go to the bathroom, when we eat, what we wear. They are my children. Those are the people that I have almost limitless authority with.
The reason why I have grown to despise democracy is because it's not we the people. A raw universal, because that's what we have is a universal democracy. Everyone is allowed to vote. Right. Everyone. And just for the record, I think the 19th Amendment should be repealed. I think that because, well, first and foremost, because I'm a Christian, and that is the Christian position. Oh my gosh, you're saying that? Yes, that is the Christian position, is that households should not be divided against one another. So it's not just elevating a male vote, but it's elevating the household vote. We're saying that that society, if you break it down to the basic building block, is not atomistic as individuals, but molecular, being households. The way that God sees humanity is He breaks them down to families, and so that it's not just random individual atoms all bouncing around together, and 350 million atoms bouncing together in one nation, on one piece of land, but it's families. And so by repealing the 19th Amendment, just for the record, it's not just trying to take away a female vote, but it's trying to say, no, there's a family vote. Right. There's a household. And it's like, well, where do women get their voice? Where women get their voice is from their father, from their husband. If they're not married, it's from their father. If they're not married and their father is dead, it's from their brother, it's from their uncle, it's the men in their lives that love them.
Wow, what a loser, right? So check out part 1 for the full psychological breakdown of the sadism and enmeshment that is inherent to his patriarchal worldview. Today, we're shifting from the psychological to the historical to debunk his obviously bullshit claim that patriarchal men will naturally step up and provide, protect, and advocate for their women, folk, and children property, but only once women have been stripped of all human rights. Apparently, that's been the missing ingredients this entire time, ladies. It's not that you're not communicating well. It's not that he doesn't understand how to meet needs. It's that he can only meet needs and participate if you don't have any human rights. Who knew? Who knew? So the truth is, men like this want to silence women so they can prey upon women and children without recourse, right? To ensure that their sexual depravity only be limited by their own imaginations, not social consequence. As history shows, when white Christian patriarchs are left to govern without women's interference, child rape is legal, child trafficking is rampant, and men's unchecked depravity spreads STIs at a rate that we genuinely cannot fathom today. So let's talk about it. Our main source today is this Smithsonian Magazine article written by historian Kimberly Hamlin of Miami University, linked in bio with all other sources, as per usual. What raising the age of sexual consent taught women about the vote. Before many women could vote in the United States, they lobbied male legislators to change statutory rape laws and gained political skills in the process. The first bill ever proposed by a female lawmaker in the United States came from Colorado State Representative Carrie Clyde Hawley in January 1895. Building on a decade of women's activism, Hawley's ambitious legislation sought to raise the age of consent in the state to 21 years old. In 1890, the age which girls could consent to sex was 12 or younger in 38 states. In Delaware, it was 7. Yeah, that's a second grader. That's a second grader who doesn't know how to read. Such statutes had consequences extending from the safety and well-being of young girls to women's future place and their potential for upward mobility. To women reformers of various stripes, temperance advocates, labor leaders, and suffragettes, Hawley and her historic bill symbolized what was possible when women gained a voice in politics: the right to one's own body, the most fundamental human right that exists. By petitioning legislatures in dozens of states to revise statutory rape laws, these women forged interracial and cross-class collaborations and learned the political skills they later used to push for suffrage. Let's pause to look at this map real quick, right? So this shows state by state the age of consent in 1890. And you will notice the majority of states set it at 10 years old. And to be clear, all lawmakers in 1890 were white Christian men, predominantly Protestants, right? And they would get into their fancy chambers and their rotunda, the fancy-ass state capitals, and they would come and they would debate. They would debate how young of a child could consent to being sexually used by an adult man. In the late 19th century, the prevalence of sexual assault and sexually transmitted infections compelled thousands of women to political action. Based on English common law dating back to the 1500s, American lawmakers had selected 10 or 12 as the age of consent to coincide with the onset of puberty, as if once a girl menstruated, she was ready to have sex. Men accused of raping girls as young as 7 could and did simply say, "She consented," to avoid prosecution. Reformers understood that once ruined, these young victims of assault could be forced into prostitution because no man would marry or hire a fallen woman. What a racket! What a racket! Man rapes a child, then ruins that child, and now they get to traffic that child to other adult men for his financial profit. This is what I mean when I say patriarchy's only goals are male pleasure seeking and male status seeking, and that they feel entitled to F and exploit absolutely anything and anyone in service of their ego and their, boundless. Prostitution especially concerned wives and mothers because before penicillin became widely available in 1945, syphilis and gonorrhea were more widespread than all other infectious diseases combined. All right, let's be very clear. That's because of men. The sexual double standard was basically any woman that stepped out on her husband could be stoned to death, thrown in the river, lit on fire. So it was not women that were spreading this around, right? It was men's uncontrolled sexual depravity. Wives who unknowingly contracted STIs from their husbands could pass them on to their unborn children, resulting in miscarriages, fetal abnormalities, blindness, epilepsy, and unsightly syphilis teeth. In most cases, women could not successfully sue for divorce, support themselves, or retain custody of their children if they did divorce. What they wanted was a way to hold men accountable for their actions and a semblance of control over what happened to their bodies and their children. Women believed that raising the age of consent for girls would diminish the number of working prostitutes and alleviate a host of social ills caused by the double standard. Right? So that says it all, right? That there was such a pipeline of men violating children and then pimping them out and trafficking them. This was a huge problem. But also, with the divorce thing, just quick note. The divorce double standard proves that these patriarchal Christian men are so full of shit when they say, a woman's natural place is caring for her children. All women are meant to be mothers. That's your place. That's your role. They are so full of shit. Because if they actually believed that, they would never separate a mother and a child. Not even an event of divorce. At best, patriarchal men use children as pawns to control, extort, and manipulate women. And at worst, they sexually and financially exploit and abuse children for their own profit. Let's continue. Most often, women worried about sexual violence, prostitution, and STIs joined the temperance movement because they believed that alcohol fueled abuse against women and children, and because, unlike discussing sex, talking about alcohol didn't breach societal taboos. In 1879, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was by far the largest women's organization in the country. This American movement, temperance, drew inspiration from its counterpart in England. British Puritan reformers had succeeded in raising the age of consent to 13 in 1861, and the movement received international attention in 1885 after muckraking journalist William T. Stead went undercover in London's brothels. Stead published a series of salacious articles collectively titled The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon in the Pall Mall Gazette, detailing how London's husbands and fathers paid top dollar to deflower child virgins in the city's brothels. Within months, public outcry led Parliament to raise the age of consent to 16. What is done in the dark will always come to the light. But change in the United States proved much more challenging. Following the success of the British campaign, the WCTU made raising the age of consent a top priority because, as the group's long-term president, Francis Willard, remarked, the Siamese twins of vice are strong drink and the degradation of women. I would argue that the Siamese twins of vice are men's ego and men's submission to each other. That's where all vice starts, if you ask me. But between 1886 and 1900, the WCTU petitioned every state legislature in the country, garnering more than 50,000 signatures in Texas alone. And they dispatched women to legislative sessions from coast to coast to demand that the age of consent be raised to 18. Many lawmakers rejected women's presence in public affairs and further resented the unprecedented campaign to curtail white men's sexual prerogatives. Well, ain't that the truth, honey? So they stonewalled WCTU members, inserting neutralizing or mocking language in their proposed bills, and occasionally outright banned women from their galleries. The few legislators who went on the record in support of young ages of consent voiced sympathy for the hypothetical men who would be ensnared into marriage by conniving little girls who consented to sex and then later threatened to press charges. That's a pretty sophisticated con for a child. I gotta be real. I hate my mom. I'm gonna get married. Like, that's wild. Okay. It's just another timeless patriarchal tradition. It's like a form of Darvo, right? Which is deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. This is a pattern that you see in domestic and sexual abuse very often, right? So adult men are so worried that 7 to 10-year-old little girls are going to seduce them and trick them into marriage. Like, these adult men must be protected from conniving children. And since women aren't allowed to talk about sex, I don't know how these little kids are going to know about it enough to initiate a seduction like that. But, you know, you gotta think of the men. Will somebody think of the grown-ass men? I like how these two things live together, right? Think of the men and how they will be seduced by children. But also, men are the only ones that are rational and strong enough to lead. How do you hold both of those thoughts at once? 135 years later, and men's playbook just has not changed at all. It's always the same. Anyway, by 1900, 32 states had raised the age of consent between 14 and 18. But most Southern state legislators refused to budge. For years, Black women, including Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Ida B. Wells, had called attention to the fact that white men use rape as a tool of white supremacy. Supremacies always co-create. Patriarchy always co-creating with white supremacy, always co-creating with capitalism. Like, they are always co-creating. For a brief period before 1900, white women worked together with African American women, mainly in the WCTU, to revise age of consent laws. Before they were disenfranchised and forced out of office after Reconstruction, African American male legislators in the South also advanced legislation to raise the age of consent. White male Southern lawmakers stridently opposed revised age of consent laws because they did not want Black women to be able to charge white men with a crime. The crime of trafficking their children. Kentucky State Representative A.C. Tompkins went on the record with his opposition explaining, quote, "We see at once what a terrible weapon for evil the elevating of the age of consent would be when placed in the hands of a lecherous, sensual Negro woman," implying that Black women, who he claimed matured earlier and had a more sexual nature, would seduce men and then accuse them of assault. These poor grown-ass men, they're getting attacked by children, by women, like, whew, we gotta protect these men. We should probably get them out of public for their own protection, right? Like, us women are gonna have to step up, take control of all political and economic governance so that our menfolk, our delicate menfolk, can be tucked away safe at home where women and children can't seduce them and cause them to stumble into sin. That's what I'm taking away from this argument. What about you? But as the historian Kelsey K. Dunlap has documented, white legislators did pass new rape laws that allowed for brutal punishment, including castration, because those laws were targeted at Black men and were used to justify lynching and disenfranchisement. In a previous video, I made a joke about how we should castrate men who commit sexual violence, and then I was like, well, we actually shouldn't. This is why, because it would be a tool for white supremacy. That is literally the only reason why I don't think we should be medieval and castrating men who commit sexual violence. It is a reasonable idea of how to disarm them, but other men would weaponize it against people of color, and like, I guess we should try and imagine a future that's not based on like brutality and imprisonment, but they make it hard. They make it hard. Thanks to the lobbying of the WCTU, most Southern states raised the age of consent to 13 or 14, but these laws fell short of reformers' goals, as they generally pertained only to white girls and those who could prove they were virgins at the time. Right? Because it's not a problem for a man to rape a child if some other man already did it, right? Right? That child's ruined now. So now that man should own her and traffic her, right? That only makes sense. These uphill campaigns proved to the activists, many of whom had not before been ardent suffragettes, that women needed the vote and a voice in the legislatures. As pioneering physician Emily Blackwell noted, Opponents of women's suffrage insisted that men were always ready to remove any proved injustice to women. Yet the fact remains that the first states to raise the age of consent to that of majority were those in which women had a direct voice in politics: Wyoming and Kansas. In the 1880s, many of the WCTU's thousands of members had stopped short of demanding the vote. By the end of the century, however, the unified and vocal support of the WCTU helped transform women's suffrage into a mainstream movement. So ultimately, our heroine from the beginning, Colorado Representative Holly, she did get her age of consent law passed, although the Senate reduced it to 18, not 21, as she originally wanted. But hey, massive victory, right? And along the way, her male colleagues mocked her efforts, right? They kept referring her bills to fake committees to try and get her to stop introducing the same legislation over and over. And like the open ridicule of grown-ass men mocking women for saying, "Don't F children." Regardless, she succeeded, and her victory established that pattern, right? When states recognized women's right to vote, age of consent laws and penalties for rapists and child traffickers all increased. And eventually, every state raised the age of consent to at least 14 years old. And of course, this radicalized women, right? Like, of course, because all the patriarchal masks and myths and bullshit fell off as soon as the men that they were taught and conditioned to defer to without question, these white, Christian, well-educated, wealthy men who were supposed to lead and take care of everyone and correct any injustice, when they challenged them to say, hey, you know what? Child rape and trafficking shouldn't be legal. That should not be effing legal. And these men responded with contempt, with mockery. Are you kidding? While also claiming self-victimization that these grown-ass men were going to be manipulated by literal children? Like, are you kidding me? And it was that realization of, holy shit, these men cannot be trusted, that solidified the suffrage movement and ended up securing the 19th Amendment's victory. If men had been reasonable, responsible, or effing moral at all, the 19th Amendment probably would not have passed. And honestly, I think we're experiencing a similar feminine awakening today. The patriarchal myths and masks have fallen. Women are realizing that the abuse that we have experienced at the hands of men is not an individual failing that we have to assume responsibility for. It is the intentional results of patriarchal systems. When we center men's entitlement to pleasure-seeking and status-seeking at the literal expense and degradation of everyone else, the only results are violence, addiction, poverty, degradation, and child trafficking. And the greatest sin in patriarchy is to speak unvarnished truth to a man, to hold up a mirror and show him who he really chooses to be. I'm going to wrap it there. Drop a line in the comments. What was the most surprising aspect of this history to you? Personally, I had no idea that STIs were more prevalent than every other infectious disease combined. Like, wow, that's kind of shocking, right? Because the 1800s, there's no antibiotics, and people had like 10 kids hoping 5 of them would make it to adulthood because typhoid fever, yellow fever, cholera, like, but somehow syphilis and gonorrhea took the cake. Like, that's insane. As always, like and subscribe for weekly videos. I'm on TikTok at Coco Has Ideas, Instagram, Paraculture Coco, free writing up at paraculturecoco.substack.com. And I'll see you next time, my friends.